Ladies and gentlemen, if I may, I'd like to wish you a warm welcome here for this ceremony to receive the title of Doctor Honoris Causa to Lisa Waddington. She's a professor in European law at the University of Maastricht. Since 2008, the opening session of the academic year traditionally was a moment for our university to distinguish to an excellent, or to a person for her excellent quality scientifically, as a citizen and as a human being. This year, for the first time, this opening session and the title Dr. Honoris Causa has been coupled. Indeed, Lisa Waddington spent time, was on sabbatical at the University of Melbourne between August 2022 and March 2023. And of course, now the theme chosen for the conference of today has a link with the stay in Australia of Lisa Waddington. When staff and persons with disabilities and universities meet, there are thoughts and we think about international law and we compare. This year is the last year where the Saint-Louis University is delivering such a diploma of Doctor Honoris Causa as Université Saint-Louis. Indeed, as from September 2023, our institution will be merged with the Catholic University of Louvain, and it's within this new university that will have our DHCs, Doctor Honoris Causa titles. And in view of the perspectives, and before all, the fact of bearing in mind this title of Doctor Honoris Causa can only comfort me in the sense of this pointed, inclusive perspective, I would say. And of course, we have the professor that's going to replace me. I'd like to thank her warm-heartedly for her determination. She'll be there for our institution, and this will be for all of you, of course. During the academic year 2008-2009, that celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Université Saint-Louis, the first titles, Doctor Honoris Causa, were delivered amongst other people to Nel Paxinou, stage director, comedian, founder of the Baladin du Miroir, Nel Paxinou, and they were using the following words. I'll say what Nel Paxinou said. We talked today about inclusion. Well, I created inclusion because it's myself that founded the company. I recruited people, and thus the question wasn't even raised to know whether I was a disabled person, yes, no, if I needed to be helped, supported, yes or no. I was not, as a person with disabilities. No, I was just the employer. We were all on the same boat. We were all dealing and managing the same inclusion. As university, what a nice tribute for this person who unfortunately left us in October 2022. She continues to write the inclusive story via the Doctor Honoris Causa. It's a kind of mirror game, you could say, between the first DHC and the last DHC handed out by a university. From the Université Saint-Louis to the UC Louvain, it's only one step forward, basically. On the 25th of April 29, the UC Louvain was handing over the titles of Doctor Honoris Causa to Anne Lawson, professor of the Faculty of Law of the University of Leeds. Her works concern mainly the rights of the differently abled, and also it's about the implementation of these in the national policies, European policies, also international policies. From Anna Lawson to Liz Waddington, as you will have noticed, there's only one step. And if you're not aware of this, it's the same between Liz Waddington and Joseph Skovanik, and I'd like to say hello there too. During our meeting on the 28th of September, I was asking the public to bear in mind this name, Lisa Waddington. Just like Joseph Chovanec, Lisa Waddington will indeed mark in a durable way our university, and it's about rethinking differently. And in fact, if you take the work to render more accessible this auditorium, and I'd like to thank the technical team of the university that steered the work, managed the work, and I'd also like to ask the students, Hatim Adat, with the support of Clara Woti, they offered us their precious expertise. I'm here, I'm a happy rector, happy director, and it's true that we are here with people that have a link with the person honored, the theme tackled, or our university. Amongst these people, I'd like to salute more specifically the presence of the Atelier Indigo. Since 2015, they have supported us with about 20 artists in a situation of handicap, and they've been here to support us actively. This evening, just like last year, we had the Alter conference on the institution, disinstitutionalization and handicap. They'll be here supporting us, flanking us. They'll do that during the whole ceremony. They are here to support us. And basically, we are honoring, of course, Lisa Waddington. To all of you here present or online, I'd like to warm-heartedly thank you for sharing with us this incredible moment. I wish you an excellent event.
Dear Lisa, dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, one day I had been told that Lisa Waddington would honor our university with her presence. If one day I had been told that Lisa Waddington would offer to work with us on our policies and practices of inclusion. One day I had been told that Lisa Waddington would be a key player in an inclusive project that is taking shape within this university. I would have smiled. I would certainly have smiled widely. But would I have believed it? That's the question. Dear audience, today, thanks to Sébastien van Rogenbroek, who had the brilliant idea to get in touch with her, Lisa Waddington is here among us. Lisa Waddington, a name that resonates with everyone who works in the field of equality and disability, is a dream come true. Lisa, to elaborate on this dream, allow me to switch to French. Chère Lisa, très chère Lisa, depuis le début de ta carrière, tu
Dear
témoignes.
Lisa, since the beginning of your career, you've been relentlessly determined to defend the rights of people with a disability, and more specifically, the labor or the world of work. And more specifically, in 1989, you launched yourself in this PhD, the topic being the people in a situation of handicap. And that was the title of your PhD, your thesis at the European University of Florence. And it's true, and we notice that the United States are in advance compared to the European continent. However, as Globetrotter, you spent 1 year in Washington to get to know the breakthroughs, and thanks to your pioneering thesis, your multiple texts, consecutive texts, you drained real change in mentalities, and you injected a dream. You have a dream. It's about boosting the recognition of the rights of disabled people, and with Spearhead, the principle of equality. This dream, dear Lisa, you wrote about it. Indeed, Gerard Quinn, Art Hendricks, Theresia Degener, Mark Bell, Anna Lawson, Eleanor Flynn are all great names, and names that you know really well, people that you know really well. These are essentials. And here we're talking about the European Yearbook of Disability Law. Your colleagues, your friends, that European Forum enabled to come in touch with these people, and the DREAM project, Dream for Disability Rights, Expanding Accessible Markets. But the dream, it's also that Lisa does not just write with big names, also she contributes to create big names, to train new generations of researchers such as Andrea Broderick, of course, or Delia Ferry also. Alone or with others, with this historical perspective, Lisa Waddington clashes swords with positive actions, and it's about dealing with discrimination via the associations also. And we're talking about employment, also consumption, health, education, and it's about European law, it's about United Nations laws also, and also recently, dear Lisa, you wrote that you qualified people with a handicap. You said, or it was said that they were vulnerable, and we had to be careful vis-à-vis our approach. As from the introduction of your thesis, you were explaining different notions such as impairment, disability, handicap, and then you concluded, page 313, it's the concept of, in brackets, normal, that creates disabled people. And of course, it's about being direct, and that's what we can clearly see in your different articles. Still getting it wrong, in brackets, not disabled enough, in brackets. That's how in 2015, those were the titles you gave to two of your texts in 2015, basically, in a nutshell. And of course, it's about seeing how you apprehend handicap. And it's about seeing what's done at the level of discrimination and how you can get rid of discrimination. And so, Lisa Waddington, are we talking about the dream of university? Are we talking about the nightmare or nightmares of jurisdictions? Not at all. The Supreme Court in Ireland, via a study that was co-signed, and here, of course, we're talking of the European Court of Human Rights, and there's a question of the theory, there's the question of the illusions, and it's about touching, it's about transforming. If Lisa loves law, it's to use it as a lever. If she loves the university, it's like avant-garde. She loves research. Research is very important also, and it's about not staying in books, but walking the talk, of course. To associate civil society to the supervision of the European Research Project, there, and with Andrea Broderick, you presented your study on the post-2020 European strategy. You went to Australia to meet the Professor Paul Harbour. He transformed the University of Queensland and it became an inclusive laboratory. Now you're here to share with us inclusive practices, and you've had many stays abroad. You've observed, you've analyzed, and you've compiled a lot. Lisa, last year, you suggested to the scientific committee to come back in October 2023 to focus on our practices, inclusive practices, that is, and inclusive policies. We have a wonderful present that cannot be turned down. I understood that here it's about transforming from the inside. That's extremely important. The dream only interests you if it becomes reality. Honors trigger happiness. And it's important that the university be there for society. And of course, you did not deny the words of your promoter, Christopher Macruden. Already in 1995, he underlined as introduction to the thesis that too often there's the question of the importance of linking the theory of real problems. So linking these real problems to the theory and vice versa. And of course, there's a question of neglecting or not anti-discrimination actions. And also it's about the analysis of the Dr. Lisa Waddington that confirms the interest of linking all these elements. Also, your scientific career has been absolutely amazing, and Lisa Waddington is, above all, a simple person, accessible person, and an incredibly generous person also. I got to know your name before your text, before I met you. Since then, more than your scientific qualities, your profound humanity, I can say that I really appreciate your profound humanity. Being human, being Waddington, being human, it's the title of the wonderful biography of Judith Human, American militant of disabled people, the rights of disabled people. Being Waddington, this book does not exist yet. And yet, dear Lisa, in your own way, you have your research style. But from dream to reality, your personality needs to be honored. And at the same time, it's about being inclusive always, of course.
Attendu que Madame Lisa Waddington, née le 27 décembre
Miss Lisa Waddington, born on the 27th of December 1966, has a diploma in law developed by the Birmingham University. Given her title as a doctor in law, she received this title in 1993 by the European University Institute of Florence, and her thesis was called More Disabled Than Others, the Employment of Disabled People Within the European Community, an analysis of existing measures and proposals for reform. Given that Lisa Waddington is an extraordinary professor of European law on disabilities at the University of Maastricht, where she's been working since 2004 within the International Law Department and European Department, Professor Lisa Waddington co-wrote, co-managed numerous articles, scientific texts having to do with equality and non-discrimination.
She mobilizes resources of the European rights as well as
Attendu que Lisa Waddington est impliquée dans plusieurs projets de recherche européens, a décroché nombre de financements internationaux et formé plusieurs chercheuses reconnues dans le champ du handicap. Attendu qu'elle est également l'autrice et la co-autrice de très nombreux rapports et recommandations à l'intention notamment de la Commission européenne. Attendu que Lisa Waddington est par ailleurs membre de plusieurs réseaux internationaux, comités éditoriaux et organismes de recherche, comme par exemple le Conseil consultatif du Centre de droit comparé de Berkeley en matière d'égalité et de non-discrimination. Attendu qu'elle est coutumière de séjours et conférences à l'étranger au sein de prestigieuses universités aux États-Unis, en Australie, en Irlande ou encore au Royaume-Uni. Attendu qu'en plus d'être une experte confirmée en droit du handicap et dans le domaine des discriminations, la professeure Lisa Waddington est considérée comme pionnière en Europe. Que son excellence scientifique se double du souci de faire jouer aux universités un rôle avant-gardiste en matière d'inclusion, destiné à servir de modèle à l'échelle sociétale. Attendu que Lisa Waddington allie à ses qualités professionnelles remarquables une profonde humanité dont témoigne la simplicité et la générosité avec lesquelles elle partage son expertise engagée. Attendu qu'un tel parcours académique, scientifique, citoyen et personnel synthétise tout ce que notre université tient en plus haute estime et incarne les valeurs qu'elle s'efforce de transmettre à ses étudiantes et ses étudiants. Attendu que Lisa Waddington représente une puissante force inspiratrice et transformatrice dans le cadre du tournant inclusif que notre université a emprunté quelques années, nous, Pierre Jadoul, en vertu des pouvoirs qui nous ont été conférés, nommons et proclamons Lisa Waddington, docteur honoris causa de l'Université Saint-Louis Bruxelles.
That's a gift in the name of Atelier Indigo. Very much. And because we fight for the rights of people sent for us. Yeah.
Université Saint-Louis Bruxelles me fait un grand honneur aujourd'hui par l'octroi de ce doctorat.
It's a great honor for me to receive this doctorate honoris causa. I'd like to thank you, the rector of the university. Thank you to the professor also. Also, I'd like to thank the vice rector, research, Professor Yves Caton. I'm profoundly delighted, and thank you to the scientific committee. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Professor Jochen Frieling, and more specifically, thank you to all the professors. I'd like to thank the staff of the university also. Thank you for organizing this event. And thank you for rendering this event accessible to a wider public. I'll continue in English.
Today, I would like to explore an issue in which I have a personal interest, and that is the legal obligations that universities are under with regard to the employment of staff with disabilities, and how universities go about meeting those obligations. Now, I have a personal interest in this topic because I am both a member of staff of a university and I'm someone who has a disability. But I think that all students and all staff at universities, whether disabled or not, have a personal interest in this. Now, persons with disabilities often face particular challenges and limitations when it comes to employment, and universities, unfortunately, are no exception to that. If a university can eliminate or at least reduce to a minimum all environmental barriers which contribute to hindering the participation of staff with disabilities, then that university will create an environment in which staff with and staff without disabilities can flourish. So I think it's safe to say that if a university is a good employer for staff with disabilities, it is likely to be a good employer for all of its employees in all of their diversities. And that will contribute to making that university a good place to study for students with disabilities. They can see staff with disabilities as role models, and there will be a culture in which students with disabilities will know and experience they are supported, valued, assessed on the basis of their abilities, rather than being judged, discriminated, seen as a problem, or stigmatized because they have impairments. So all of us have an interest in making our universities fully inclusive of staff and students with disabilities. Now, in my presentation, I want to focus on three elements. Firstly, I want to look at the obligations found in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities regarding the employment of staff at universities. Now, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is one of the core human rights treaties of the UN. It reflects a paradigm shift, and that means that states which are party to the convention must ensure that their policies, laws, and actions are in line with the convention when they ratify it, and that there is a new understanding of the human rights which persons with disabilities have, and even what disability is following the adoption of the convention. But this paradigm shift is reflected in the understanding of disability, and that is the understanding that disability is the result of an interaction between the impairments that a person has and the barriers that they experience. Now, those can be physical barriers, they can be barriers related to policies or informal practices, barriers related to the attitudes and behavior of other people. Now, the UN Convention does not establish any specific obligations for tertiary education institutions regarding the employment of staff with disabilities. So my discussion is going to explore the general obligations on work and employment found in Article 27. The second thing I want to focus on in the presentation is an exploration of a case from the Netherlands concerning an academic who was discriminated against. And this reveals some common elements of disability discrimination involving university staff. And then lastly, I want to talk about some examples of what I regard as good practice, key principles and actions regarding the employment of staff with disabilities. And that is going to be based on policy documents, as well as examples of useful and practical guidance on how to achieve inclusion of staff with disabilities. So to begin with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 27 of this convention addresses work and employment, and it requires state parties to recognise the right of persons with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others. And this includes creating a work environment that is open, inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. So state parties should adopt legislation which imposes obligations on public and private sectors employers, and among the obligations which are relevant in the context of staff employed at universities are the following. Prohibition of discrimination on the basis of disability with regard to all matters and concerning all forms of employment. Protecting the rights of persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others to just and favourable working conditions, including equal opportunities and equal pay, safe and healthy working conditions, protection from harassment and redress of grievances, and ensuring that reasonable accommodations are provided to persons with disabilities in the workplace. Now, in September of last year, the UN committee, which is linked to this Disability Convention at the UN, adopted a general comment on the right of persons with disabilities to work and employment. And this general comment is useful for understanding the obligations of employers such as universities. And I want to mention some of the obligations which emerge from this general comment and from the convention. And in doing so, I invite you to consider whether your university, wherever it is already doing all of these things. So firstly, non-discrimination and equality are core obligations of Article 27 and indeed the convention as a whole. They apply throughout the employment cycle, covering recruitment, hiring and employment, ongoing employment, training programs, career advancement and exiting work. 4 main forms of discrimination are explicitly mentioned, and these should all be prohibited. Those are direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, denial of a reasonable accommodation, and harassment. And discrimination by association with someone with a disability is also prohibited. Now, these forms of discrimination can occur individually or in combination. Now, denial of a reasonable accommodation occurs when the necessary and appropriate individualized modifications, adjustments, and supports that do not involve a disproportionate or undue burden for the employer are not implemented. And the general comment gives some examples of reasonable accommodation, including making information accessible to individuals with a disability, modifying equipment, enabling working from home, providing an interpreter in meetings, reorganizing activities, rescheduling work, or providing support personnel. General comment specifies that public and private employers need to have a clear, accessible, and timely process for dealing with accommodation requests. That implies, I think, a written policy on how to deal with accommodation requests. And when a barrier is identified and a reasonable accommodation is at issue, the following 2 steps must be taken. Firstly, the organisation should work with the individual to identify potential solutions to remove or avoid the barrier. And that includes identifying the preferred solution of the person with a disability. And secondly, the organisation should then implement the preferred solution unless this would result in an undue burden. And in that case, the organisation should implement another solution that does not impose such a burden or implement the preferred solution to the extent possible without incurring the burden. Now, a failure by an organisation to implement the steps in a timely way amounts in itself to a denial of a reasonable accommodation and is therefore a form of discrimination. Now, the UN Convention has been ratified by Belgium and by all the other EU member states and indeed by the European Union itself. Now, amongst the other issues addressed in the general comment are equal pay, the need for effective remedies, the content of collective bargaining agreements, consideration for promotion on an equal basis with others through fair, merit-based and transparent procedures, and the availability of vocational training courses which are accessible to persons with disabilities. And the general comment also provides that employers should respect the privacy of workers with a disability and must obtain their consent to share information which is related to a disability or impairment that is disclosed to them. I'd now like to discuss with you a case which I think reflects some fairly common discriminatory experiences of university staff with disabilities. The case in question comes from my own country, the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the Act on Equal Treatment of Disabled and Chronically Ill People has prohibited disability discrimination with regard to employment since 2003. And it prohibits all the forms of discrimination referred to in the general comment, including a denial of a reasonable accommodation. The Netherlands Institute for Human Rights, or the College voor de Rechten van de Mens in the Netherlands, plays an important role in interpreting and applying equality legislation. And it has a quasi-judicial task, and in this capacity, it hears individual complaints and issues opinions. And it's one of those opinions from 2012 that I'd like to discuss with you. So the claimant in this case was a woman who had a form of autism, so she was neurodiverse. And her employer was a university in the west of the Netherlands. And it had seconded her to work for an institute which carried out research on behalf of third parties on education, development, and projects aimed at young people. So the institute was connected to the university, and the university was the respondent. Now, the claimant did not meet the work targets which she had been set over a number of years. And this was because she was not asked to work on external projects. And that was because the colleagues in the institute didn't want to work with her. So that meant, in fact, that she could not meet the targets because those targets concerned income generation. Now, the claimant eventually received coaching in an attempt to improve the situation. And she also asked for some accommodations from her employer, including receiving information in writing, working on tasks one at a time instead of working on tasks more than one task simultaneously, and not being exposed to a hectic work environment with lots of work pressure and short deadlines. And these accommodations were also suggested to the employer by the company doctor who had seen the claimant. And in response, the institute, the employer, took the position that even with these accommodations, the claimant would not be able to do her job. And furthermore, the institute could not be expected to make these accommodations. So when the case came before the human rights body, the body first had to consider whether the claimant was actually fit to carry out the work, and therefore it had to consider the relevance of a reasonable accommodation in this respect. And it found that the assessment of the institute that the claimant was not able to carry out her work could not be seen in isolation and separate from her disability. And the human rights body also found that the information that the company doctor and the coach had given to the employer meant it was clear that the problems were linked to her disability, and the employer was aware of this. Now, the company doctor had advised that the institute should take account of the claimant's disability, and the claimant's coach had also given the same advice. So the institute was fully informed about the need for accommodation. Now, the human rights body held that the institute, the employer, had a duty to investigate whether the accommodations requested would allow the claimant to work on external projects, and it had done this to an insufficient extent. And it noted that following the coaching, the claimant had successfully worked on 2 internal projects. The human rights body also found that the institute had not allowed the claimant to work on external projects, and so it had not looked into whether the claimant was able to carry out this sort of work with the appropriate accommodations. So it found that the institute had insufficiently investigated the situation, and it could not determine, the employer could not determine the claimant wasn't fit to carry out the work. Human rights body also found that the institute, the employer, had not taken action against the colleagues who did not want to work with the claimant on the projects, and that meant the institute had taken insufficient care to provide a workplace which was free of discrimination. And the human rights body found that the institute had a responsibility to support the claimant and to discuss with her and the colleagues about how to remove the barriers. So the human rights body concluded that the institute, the university, had directly discriminated against the claimant, and it had also failed to meet its obligations to provide a reasonable accommodation by failing to investigate sufficiently whether accommodations could be made. So I chose to discuss this case because it involves a number of themes which are fairly common in the case of disability, discrimination, and staff with disabilities at universities. We have the unsubstantiated claim that a person is not able to do the job because they have a disability. The unsubstantiated claim that a reasonable accommodation was not possible or feasible. A failure to investigate with the person with a disability whether a reasonable accommodation would allow her to do the job, and that in itself is a failure to provide a reasonable accommodation. And a failure to address discriminatory behaviour of colleagues, and a failure to remove barriers which prevent the worker with a disability from doing her job. So, I now want to talk about some examples of good practice. And this draws on a set of resources and guidelines which I will mention at the end of my presentation, as well as practices which I've come across whilst doing research in this area, including, as Professor Jadul said, on a recent visit to a number of universities in Australia. So I stress, this is not a toolkit to eliminate disability discrimination, or to ensure that reasonable accommodations are provided, or to guarantee inclusion. Although, at the end of this presentation, I will direct you towards such a toolkit. What this is, a set of examples of good practice that I want to present to you in the hope that you will find them interesting, and also in the hope that they will encourage you to think about what you can do at your university and what your university can do. So I'd like to begin by mentioning 4 key principles which I think are essential for the development of policies and practices which are inclusive of staff and students with disabilities, as well as some related good practice. So there, the 4 principles are nothing about us without us, building disability inclusion into all policies, setting goals and targets, and monitoring and reporting, and support from leadership at a senior level. So, nothing about us without us. Involving staff with disabilities in policy making is good for the university. And these are policies which are relevant to staff with disabilities, which I think are policies which are relevant to all staff. So by involving staff with disabilities, the university can ensure that the people with the most expertise are involved in developing disability-related policies. And that contributes to the development of policies which work and which are in line with the university's goals. Quite simply, it leads to better policies. It also removes the obligation to develop on their own disability-related policy from staff members who have no specific expertise in the field of disability, such as staff members at Human Resources who have to cover many topics. The example that I want to present to you here is the Disability Inclusion Group of the University of Queensland in Brisbane. So this was established in 2016 under the leadership of Professor Paul Harper. And it aims to apply the principle of nothing about us without us to all University of Queensland business. That means that decisions, decision-making, policy and programs should not be done without the full and direct participation of staff and students with disabilities. This group, the acronym is DIG. DIG provides a consultative mechanism for developing and implementing disability inclusion initiatives across the University of Queensland. DIG also helps to draft and monitor the university's strategic disability action plan. And when other sectors of the university need information about disability, they reach out to the Disability Inclusion Group And the Disability Inclusion Group can then reach out to a wider network of staff and students with disabilities who can help identify barriers and the best way to remove them. So DIG enables others at the university to achieve their goals. Now, DIG consists of staff and students with lived experiences of disability, as well as staff working in key areas, such as the library, information and technology services, and property and facilities. Chair of DIG must be a person with a disability. It has between 16 and 20 members. It meets quarterly, and Professor Paul Harper is the chair of DIG. And in that capacity, he sits as an observer on the Senate Committee for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion and on the academic board. So the Disability Inclusion Group staff and students with disabilities are present at the highest level of the university. The Disability Inclusion Group is also a means of giving staff with disabilities the opportunity to develop and exercise leadership skills. And you can find out more about DIG and its terms of reference through that hyperlink. Another example of good practice is the Disability Equality Steering Group at University College London. So this group represents the views of disabled staff and staff who are closely associated with disabled people, and it acts as a body of expertise on disability issues at University College London. And there is the hyperlink to their terms of reference. Now, while it is important to involve staff and students with disabilities in policy making and monitoring, and indeed in planning the reasonable accommodations which they need as individuals, it's also important to be aware of advocacy exhaustion. And that occurs when staff with disabilities no longer have the energy to contribute to policy making or even to carry on discussing their needs, such as reasonable accommodation. And one way of dealing with this is by having allies who facilitate individual as well as systemic cultural change. And with regards to systemic change, the Disability Inclusion Group at the University of Queensland consists of members from 7 key areas in the university. That's workplace diversity and inclusion, student affairs, property and facilities, the university library, information and technology services, governance and risk, and health, safety and wellness. So those individuals are responsible for transmitting the information, the decisions, the plans concerning disability, staff and students with disabilities, for their services, and operationalizing change. So I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Professor Paul Harper and Professor Elizabeth Kendall. So Professor Paul Harper is standing in the middle there with his dog Sean. To Paul's right is Professor Elizabeth Kendall from Griffiths, who I'm going to mention in a moment. And I am standing to Paul's left. And that photo was taken at Griffiths University in Brisbane in March. The second principle, disability inclusion must be built into all policies. It must not be something separate. It must not be an add-on. Disability inclusion is not something to be done on top of the tasks that staff and units already have to do. Disability inclusion must become part of the day-to-day activities affecting how staff interact with each other and with students. So, for example, disability inclusion should be part of the training given to staff in areas such as recruitment and assessment practices. There should be mandatory training on equality and inclusion for all staff, as is the case at the University of Leeds in the UK. Thirdly, a third principle, targets have to be set for achieving goals related to disability inclusion. Persons and the units responsible for taking this action must be identified, and there must be a deadline for achieving targets or goals. So in this respect, I'll quote from the Leeds University Equality and Inclusion Framework, and that says, actions will be measurable, have clear ownership, and will be prioritized with timescales and milestones for delivery. Now, this can be done by setting disability action plans or programs at the university, and many universities already have such action plans or programs. So the University of Queensland Disability Action Plan 2023-2025 has just been launched. This is their 8th iteration of a disability action plan. They started in the last century. University of Leeds also has a disability equality framework, and the hyperlinks there are to those two documents. So monitoring and reporting on achievements and failures must also take place. And this, of course, should be built into the monitoring and reporting that's already being done, rather than being something additional. And monitoring of data allows universities to track the impact of their actions to advance disability equality for staff and students. Once again, monitoring must also involve staff with disabilities reflecting the principle, nothing about us without us. And it's important that that reporting on results is transparent. And then my fourth principle, leadership for this work must be at a senior level at the university, such as the rector's office. This must be something that matters to the university. Leadership must send out a signal to all staff and students that this is expected of them and they should work on disability inclusion. So disability inclusion and creating an inclusive environment more generally must be one of the core values of the university, and this must be accepted and understood by staff and students. I now want to address a few specific areas. Recruitment, creating a space where staff with disabilities can come together, assessment and appraisals, and disability-specific policies and reasonable accommodation. So begin with recruitment. It's important that attraction and selection processes are welcoming and inclusive, and various factors can facilitate this. Now, there's a short article written by William E. Donald and Larissa Yarovaya entitled 10 Ways Universities Can Reject Ableism, and the first way, which they identify, is inclusive attraction and selection processes. They make a number of suggestions, recommendations, which I'm going to put to you. Firstly, including students and staff with disabilities in marketing literature and using inclusive language in job postings. And then consider using alternative measures for productivity when making selection and promotion decisions, since measures such as publications, professional service, or teaching load can often disadvantage persons with disabilities. And I will discuss this assessments in a little bit more detail in a moment. Ensuring reasonable accommodations are made during the recruitment process, and make it clear in the job posting that job applicants can request reasonable accommodations, and ensure that this information is initially received not by the interview panel, but only by human resources. And if it's necessary for the interview panel to be aware of the accommodation request, then this should only happen once a decision has been made to invite the candidate to the interview. And of course, the job applicant must consent to the disclosure of this information to the interview panel. And then include persons with disabilities on the interview panel. And think about the challenges persons with disabilities have overcome. Their skills and tenacity they have developed can help your organization, can help your university. Secondly, create a space where staff with disabilities come together, and indeed where students and disabilities can come together. So for staff, this can be done through a focus or a network on research and disability. We know that such research is often carried out by staff with disabilities. It can also be important to provide training targeted at staff with disabilities, for example, leadership training. Now, to give you an example of one research network, at Griffith University in Brisbane, one of the university's core interdisciplinary research programs is Inclusive Futures, Reimagining Disability. That is led by Professor Elizabeth Kendall. Across the university, that has over 200 academic staff involved in that research network, including many staff who have disabilities. And the program involves working with people with disabilities and the community to co-create research. And this program has generated millions of dollars of funding for Griffiths. Moving on to assessment and appraisals. Now, these are important in determining initial appointments, how well staff are performing in their current position and with regard to promotion. An assessment procedure which assesses performance relative to opportunity can facilitate an inclusive workplace. And it does so by taking account of personal circumstances, such as care relationships, part-time or flexible working arrangements, sick leave, and disabilities and chronic illnesses. Now, the University of Melbourne has such a policy. Staff who have experienced restricted opportunities are required to indicate the factors which had an impact on their work and their achievements due to their particular personal circumstances when they are being assessed. Now, assessing performance relative to opportunities does not assume or expect lesser standards of performance. No, instead it involves assessing the quality and the impact of the achievements relative to the opportunities that the staff member had. So I think assessments which take account of extended periods of leave, such as parental leave or sick leave, are not unusual. They're well understood. But assessing performance relative to opportunities can also be relevant to staff who experience restricted opportunities whilst working their standard working hours. And this situation can be particularly applicable for some staff with disabilities. So let me give you a few examples of why staff with disabilities who are working their standard working hours may experience restricted opportunities and how that should be taken into account when making assessments. A staff member may have to wait for an accommodation to be put in place. That accommodation could be, for example, access to specialized software or other equipment or receiving a particular training. Now, the staff member will have restricted opportunities whilst they've been waiting, and this should be taken into account in any assessment. But the staff member can be assessed according to the usual standards for the period following the putting into place of the accommodation, as long as that removes all the barriers to performance. Secondly, a staff member may need more time to write academic papers or prepare for teaching than others because of a disability-related reason, and that should be taken into account when assessing output. So again, the output should be assessed according to the usual standards regarding quality, but not quantity. Staff member who experiences pain or fatigue may opt to travel less to external conferences than other colleagues, and therefore have limited opportunities to present at such conferences. However, the staff member may have done other academic work, such as writing high-quality academic papers, and that should be taken into account when assessing research output. And a reasonable accommodation for a staff member might involve a reallocation of tasks, and therefore that staff member has a non-standard or individualized allocation of tasks. And this can enable the staff member to focus on tasks that they do well, rather than tasks which are particularly challenging for them for a disability-related reason. So that could mean doing more or less teaching than is usual for someone in that position, or more or less research, or more or less management. The staff member should only be assessed on the tasks that they were assigned and not be negatively assessed because they have not carried out certain tasks which someone in their position might otherwise be expected to do. And now I'd like to talk about disability-specific policies and a policy on reasonable accommodation. So it's important for staff and managers that their university has relevant policies in place regarding staff with disabilities. This will provide guidance to managers on how they should behave, and it will enable staff with disabilities to know how they should be treated and what to expect. So there should be both disability-specific policies and mainstream policies which include a reference to staff with disabilities where appropriate. And I want to talk about disability-specific policies now. So it's very important to have a written policy on reasonable accommodation, describing what an accommodation is, how to request it, and the process to be followed in deciding what accommodation to provide. And it's important that this policy acknowledges that making a reasonable accommodation is a legal duty, and a staff member with a disability has a right to receive an accommodation. So, back to Europe. Trinity College Dublin. Trinity College has a code of practice applying to the employment of people with disabilities, and that covers reasonable accommodation, but it also goes beyond it. There's the hyperlink to the code. So this code describes entitlements and duties regarding staff with disabilities, and it also describes the manager's obligation to implement the code. Now, Trinity has a disability service which carries out needs assessment for staff with disabilities to determine what accommodations those individuals need. So decisions regarding accommodations are not made by the line manager, who almost certainly will not have the expertise in the field. And this also means that the process can be less contentious. Over the years, the disability service at Trinity has built up a lot of expertise in identifying appropriate accommodations. The disability service at Trinity brings together expertise on reasonable accommodation, and that includes experts on technology, ergonomics, and psychologists. It has an ergonomic suite where staff and students with disabilities can try out equipment and assistive technologies. There's 12 members of staff who advise on support for staff and students with disabilities and also work on specific projects. Now, this is a small cost for a big university, and it helps them to save money. And it helps them to be a better employer for staff with disabilities, and it helps them to be a better place to study for students with disabilities. Now, once the assessment has been made, the line manager is required to facilitate the implementation of the accommodations which have been identified by the disability service. And where making the accommodation involves a financial cost, and the funding is provided from the central level of the university. And the disability service at Trinity also provides a hub and a physical meeting place for staff and students with disabilities, and it helps to create a community of persons with disabilities at that university. So I would like to conclude with some references to literature which provide guidance on how to create an inclusive university. And this literature goes into much more detail than I have been able to do in this talk. So firstly, I wholly recommend a collection of short articles on the homepage of the Times Higher Education newspaper, which are entitled Routes to Improving Disability Support in Higher Education. Now, the articles are very practically oriented, and they look at what steps can be taken within universities to be more inclusive of students and staff with disabilities. They're very short articles. They cover diverse areas such as inclusive campus design, inclusive recruitment practices, and accessibility of teaching materials. In terms of staff with disabilities, there are articles entitled 10 Steps to Recruitment Equity for Disabled Academics, 10 Ways Universities Can Reject Ableism, and Where Are the Leaders with Disability in Higher Education? And that last one was written by Paul Harper. One article introduces the resource or the report, the Disability Inclusion Framework, Promoting Disability Inclusion, a Higher Education Resource. So that was published last year. It was written by Professor Carol Evans and Dr. Zhaotong Zhu. And this is described as a checklist for making disability inclusion a reality in higher education. Now, it was based on a systematic review of 600 peer-reviewed articles and expert reports on disability inclusion. And the framework highlights the importance of promoting disabled student and staff self-advocacy and the role of higher education providers in facilitating this. And it's organized around 12 interrelated themes under 3 overarching constructs. Those 3 constructs are shared ownership, meaning disability inclusion is the responsibility of all. Empowerment, which is focused on enabling access and addressing the physical and emotional labor of advocating for basic needs. And independence, which enables students and staff with disabilities to have equal access to manage their higher education context themselves. So I hope that I have shown you that there are international obligations which are relevant for universities with regard to staff with disabilities, and indeed, which are relevant with regard to students with disabilities. Staff with disabilities at universities often face discriminatory barriers, unfortunately. But there is a lot that universities can do, put a framework in place which can prevent discrimination and make universities an open and welcoming place for persons with disabilities. And if that is done, universities will be welcome, all of us, in all of our diversity, and we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Dear Lisa, a huge thank you for your wonderful presentation, which was extremely clear and rich with perspectives. The least that can be said is that the cases and good practices you have given us provide a lot to think about and that we have work to do. We need to continue to set targets for achieving our inclusion goals. We also need to clarify what is meant by an inclusion goal. Fortunately, you will be there to guide us. Thank you. But before, thanks to you, we become more inclusive than we presently are. Let's listen to a final interlude from Les Ateliers Indigo. Many thanks to Antoine and Les Ateliers Indigo to have accompanied us so well. There is one more surprise in the room where the reception takes place. An exhibition of their work awaits us there. Now that the conference is over, it's time for the party to begin. thanks again to Lisa for being with us tonight. Thank you all, including those who followed us from a distance online. We will now have a drink to your health, and I suggest you do the same on your sides. Let's go to the exam room for the reception. It is situated on your left as you leave at the top of the flight of stairs. See you there in a moment.